No science can be denied objectivity as much as economics. In economics, the dominance of interests is more clear than in any other science. And the legitimacy of the powers at work is nowhere more questionable than in economic life. The legitimacy of politics also suffers as a result. When Lyotard declares the various types of discourse such as dialogue, teaching, legal dispensation, advertising, instruction, seduction, to be incommensurable with one another, then this is only true in a logical absolutism. From a subjective perspective, jurisprudence, advertising, seduction, etc. are certainly comparable with one another, because a goal, a purpose is intended to be achieved and one desire can be traded off against another as power behavior, i.e. it is more or less justified, assuming there is an ethical hierarchy of goods. Only if logical incommensurability is not generally set equal to any other generality, e.g. is equated with the ethical, the non-negotiable can be separated from the negotiable. If I always only deal with ends and interests, that is, if I behave pragmatically, then there is a common comparison criterion of the end or the means to such an end. My thinking and acting falls under ethical norms. Lyotard's sentence rule systems then fall into the same ethical grid. Argue, recognize, describe, tell, question, show, all for a specific purpose. What heteromorphic classes of statements are for Lyotard, i.e., denotative, prescriptive, performative, technical, evaluative, etc. statements, are compared with each other under the general term, purposive rationality. What Lyotard calls sentences, a wink, a shrug of the shoulders, a tap of the foot, a fleeting blush, can also be interpreted as intention, or motivation, and thus classified under a concept of purpose. It should always be noted that not all motives are of supra-individual relevance and therefore require a legal or moral norm, protecting the freedom of the individual. Where this does not violate the principle of reciprocity, i.e. the principle of equal rights, is one of the most important tasks of legislation. Although Lyotard speaks of the cognitive value of a description and the practical value of a prescription, in this dichotomy of facts and values he differs in no way from the modern realists. Axel Hahnemann attests that Lyotard has an affect against everything general. But it is precisely in the differentiation between describe and prescribe that he uses the old objectivist differentiation patterns. His talk about the value of cognition alone should make Lyotard suspicious, because the relativism expressed in it actually prohibits speaking of a mere description or a mere matter. It always depends on who or what something has value for. The idea that something has intrinsic value is nonsense. In view of this, Lyotard's response to the incommensurability problem, letting play, and the rejection of a higher authority, his overvaluation of language and the stubborn adherence to an unjustifiable justice, is more a sign of helplessness than the solution to a problem. Lyotard's lack of differentiation between logical and ethical generality has led him to consequences that are more confusing than plausible. Lyotard's deployment in constructing sentences is to tell the truth, but there is no such purposeless truth. Even if he makes justice the stake of a normative sentence and the will, the transmitter of an ethical sentence, Lyotard still sees something like a mere objectivity in the form of truth or knowledge, that is, a claim that is independent of the subject, supra-individual and determined by others raised to validity. Lyotard does not want to rely on the dialectics of the spirit, or the emancipation of humanity, for the validity of a postmodern scientific discourse. But he does hold on to the validity of a scientific discourse. According to Lyotard, a descriptive sentence is validated, cognitively, by recourse to an ostensive, that is, showing, sentence. This creates the impression that a description is proven by pointing a finger at an object, which is nonsense. Different subjects imagine something different when they point a finger. Depending on their level of education, their vocabulary, etc. Pointing a finger at an object does not produce a specific meaning. A description consists of nothing more than words that cannot be made into a clearly recognizable thing by any finger in the world. It is no less disturbing when Lyotard says that a proposition is the case, which is very reminiscent of Wittgenstein's positivism. This subject independence of the sentence, which is the case, then suddenly turns into a subjective matter, in that a sentence is now supposed to be validated by an individual's judgment. For Derrida, the absence of a transcendent signifier, that is, that there is no real referent for signifiers such as truth, cause, origin, or God, is a foregone conclusion. But he concludes from this that the text points to nothing outside of itself as a reference. That's why for him everything is just text. What was already clear to the nominalists? That there is no reality equivalent to general concepts, that there is de facto no such thing as fruit. This logical impossibility of the real existence of an abstraction absurdly becomes in Derrida our liberation of the signifier from the logos, and at the same time to a preference for language, or an equating of language with thinking. Although Derrida sees the idealistic hope that works in the longing for a equivalence between word and thing, his liberation of the signifier from the logos is no less speculative. Actually illusionary. The same optimism was also at work in absolutist logic, where it was thought that for the functioning of logical conclusions no concrete relation to the particular object is required. Because the general validity of logic comes into force at any time and in any place, whether one want or not. When Derrida says that there is no longer anything fundamental in an interpretation because every interpretation of an object is already the interpretation of a sign, then this only applies to an objective foundation. If the view of things falls away as an instrument of power, what is considered fundamental, for me, what I determine as fundamental, or important and less important and absolutely important, is considered fundamental, according to the consistency of my thinking. If Baudrillard considers the so-called pluralistic reality to be circus and theatre, then he is not entirely wrong. A variety of standards of correctness cannot be justified, logically. If one does not want to abandon the principle of the logical consequence altogether, then the possibility of different worlds and forms of life should not be confused with different rationalities. Even if absolute rationality, logic or truth makes no sense, the principle of non-contradiction does not have to be abandoned. The premises of a worldview are chosen more or less arbitrarily. But starting from these and relating them to them, one should be able to expect a fundamental consistency of the thoughts if it is to make any sense at all to listen to someone. Even if there is not one and only correct meaning of words, but rather more than one method that is appropriate to an object, that does not mean that everyone can do whatever they want. It is the objectivism of a logical one and only generality has become obsolete, but most of the time there is a purpose that is pursued, a benefit, a success, that determines the rules. Rules that one must submit to if one wants to achieve a goal. The question of who determines the purpose is a completely different problem, but that is not the task of the investigation here. Lyotard claims that the narrative form of communication is less violent than the logical one, but even if logical absolutism is to be condemned, a misunderstood pluralism or relativism can no less lead to the fact that mere arbitrariness becomes the law if no one agrees must no longer adhere to any rules because the principle of obligation, the acceptance of principles beyond the moment and consistency no longer apply and no one feels obliged to do anything anymore. Then the question is, what is actually less violent? There is no right to plurality in itself that does not have to be accepted by people, and acceptance means agreeing freely. If in Wolfgang Welsch's softened postmodernism a commitment is touted as a middle position between singularity and universality at the level of limited generality, then this wishy-washy solution is based on a foul compromise. There is only one commitment, and that is towards your own principles. The abandonment of a logic of unification does not mean that one must say goodbye to all logic. If logic is a logic of consequent thinking, then it is a part of ethics and as such, and in this sense no less indispensable. Showing the limits of logical absolutism does not mean that we are given a license for all sorts of nonsense, which can now be called rational, just because it is expedient. Plurality is not the new intersubjectivity because it itself does not justify anything. You can demand your own rights, but only in a community where rights already exist. No ethical value is recognized in a logical sense, but rather accepted in a moral sense by giving consent through agreement. Wherever I am not asked, I am dealing with authoritarian conditions from the era of absolutism. To be independent from individual acceptance can be called whatever you want: objectivity, intersubjectivity, transsubjectivity, or logical universality. It is the old song of foreign determination, only with new lyrics. It is not about abandoning the attitude of knowing better, as pluralists are so fond of demanding, but rather abolishing logical absolutism. There will always be a sense of better judgment because no one is infallible, not even with regard to their own principles. The talk of a world requiring several basic perspectives and not a one and only arises only from a lack of logical clarity. Because logical consistency is thought of as absolutism and not as an ethical value. Nothing is necessarily and, in itself, valuable, which is why you can't force anyone to be rational. But you can have your own opinion about such cabbage and turnips thinkers and put them in their place as soon as they become invasive. In case logical absolutism is no longer an issue. Between different basic values only one can have priority in a certain situation if anything is to be decided at all. Responsibility and commitment are a basic value. Consistent behavior and thinking is always either present or not present. There is no plurality or ambivalence, at least not when you want to come to a decision. There is no multiplicity of methods of knowing. There are a multitude of methods and there are a multitude of purposes which can be pursued. But for every purpose there are a limited number of methods which lead to the end and of which nobody will choose the worse one if a better one is possible. There is no objective knowledge because there is no objective, i.e. generally valid logic in which it does not matter which assumption is made. But one can speak of a subjective knowledge in which I myself determine whether I have learned something, that is, whether I am now wiser compared to a previous situation or not. In this subjective sense, everyone can determine for themselves what should be described as knowledge, which then leads to a multitude of knowledge that does not apply to things in themselves, but to me. And if you are dealing with a person who has no major intellectual needs, then it can also happen that what the television quiz asks about emerges as knowledge, as Lyotard so beautifully puts it. What is much more important, however, is that the necessary political framework is created so that the good qualities of human beings that have been tried and tested over centuries are promoted and not people's bad qualities. In order to make progress in this regard, it is less helpful to pander to mass taste, even if this often pays off more lucratively or seems, at first glance, to be convenient from a regulatory perspective. Capitulation to narrow-mindedness, ignorance, prejudices, provincialism, simplification. Triviality and banality already made a rather sad entry into the world of science at the beginning of the 20th century under the slogan, "World of Living." Husserl and Wittgenstein were the first protagonists at that time. Today, Habermas, Rorty and Putnam are among the enthusiasts who are impressed by the deep potential of the ways of life. But Lyotard and Foucault are also among the apostles of everyday life. Lyotard even expects the little stories, as he calls them, to be an effective resistance to the power of the big stories. Foucault preaches liberation from the uniformity of the normal existence of average people. In his Guide to Everyday Life, people are advised not to fall in love with power and to give preference to difference over the currents of unity. For Wolfgang Welch, the lifestyle of postmodern pluralism has already entered the general consciousness and has become a matter of course. The people have acquired a taste for irritation and fragmentation. The ratings of TV stations all over the country prove it. The neo-realists cook their own soup from what the people want. They represent a deep belief that is firmly anchored in human nature, a need and a longing for positive truth and certain reality, which can be found especially among average people in everyday life. Habermas landed in everyday life through his social criticism. Society is a society of everyday worlds in which sensory certainty dominates natural consciousness. It is the connection of interests between fundamental living conditions that determines the validity of statements. With Habermas, philosophy can abdicate as a primary science. Its only task is to mediate between science and everyday practice. The world of all-day life cannot be evaded. Anyone who radically doubts it must perish because of it. This is the intersubjectively valid generality of everyday world knowledge, and the claim to reason inherent in it, according to Habermas. For Habermas, everyday world is the complementary term to his theory of communicative action. Everyday life can be rationalized by releasing it for discussion. In such discussions, Habermas can even reveal unexploited semantic potentials of religious origin that have so far eluded the expressive power of philosophical language and are sometimes quite inspiring. Since 2005, Habermas has even viewed religion as a pacemaker on the path to democracy and human rights. At the beginning of the 21st century, there should be no doubt that purposeless logic has had its day. The concept of rationality or logic only makes sense in connection with a purpose, i.e., as internal logic. The means to whatever end, in the age of incommensurability, is to abandon logical, standalone, generality in favor of a relative value-based logic. The classic objectivist problem of knowledge has vanished into thin air with the incommensurability of word and thing, of individual and generality, of subject and object. The concepts of knowledge, truth, insight, reality, rationality and logic are only relevant in relation to values. A good and goods are the logical reference point. It's primarily about how important things are, and not to what extent a logical universality can be justified. The destruction of one absolute being and one and only reality cannot be overestimated. The question of fact, now only has practical value and is therefore logically on the same level as the question of justification. What counts is no longer what is, but how something is justified, and the big difference from the past is that intellectual fraud is now much more difficult. Lyotard, Derrida and company are waging a battle against logocentrism, absolutism, universalism, etc. But they are waging this battle in the arena of logocentrism and with its means on an, in itself, level. From there it is even more difficult to find the path to the individual and to the principle of freedom, but that does not mean that this aberration cannot be corrected. Against the naive idea of a certain given thing, Lyotard, Derrida, Foucault and Adorno have once again set a milestone that can no longer be overlooked, and even if an accurate analysis by the French, like Adorno, leads to unsatisfactory conclusions, their insistence on the fundamental incommensurability of word and object gives all those who actually value integrity of thought something to think about. Logical incommensurability means a promising new beginning, not only of philosophical thinking, which gives hope for real intellectual and ethical progress beyond all obtaining credibility by subreption.